Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us in our webinar today. My name is Mbuso Nkosi. I'll be the moderator for the webinar today. Today's webinar forms part of SWOP's attempt in the production of knowledge during the pandemic in conditions of no face-to-face interaction. To see more of SWOP's program again, please visit the website and also have a read at Hlengiwe's reflection, which is posted under the webinar section. This is our third webinar today. The first one was by Dana Ngata on bloodsucker violence and COVID-19 in Malawi. The second one was co-hosted with the history workshop presented by Laura Phillips on the history of mining in Libua. And today's webinar falls under the theme on education and inequality, with our presenter Hlengiwe Ndlovu presenting on saving the academic year at all costs, the brutality of an elite education system, navigating poverty and surviving the 2020 COVID-19 academic year. The webinar is recorded and is streaming live on Facebook. We will also later upload it on the SWOP YouTube account. So before I hand over to the speakers, I would like to give an aperçu regarding the field of education, as it will become apparent in today's webinar that the field of education is not only a space of socialization, learning, and pedagogy. It is also a space of life for learners and students, a space that shelters them from domestic abuse, a home for those who are at boarding schools or university residences, a space that also provides nutrition to those coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. So the closure of schools because of the pandemic meant that many learners and students found themselves in unimaginable psychological and social conditions. So with the onset of the pandemic, government has been clear that its responsibility has been about saving lives. And with the infection rate rising and South Africa becoming the epicenter of COVID-19 in Africa, the Minister of Basic Education has gone as far as to say that the field of education is a microcosm of our society. This she was saying in relation to the fact that it is not a surprise that the resumption of schools under the level 3 lockdown has seen teachers and learners getting infected with COVID-19 and others losing their lives to the virus. She also forgot to add that the South African society is a champion of inequality, and the field of education is reflecting this, and this has been exacerbated during this pandemic. Some schools will have, as we've seen, and they've argued that some schools will have difficulties with social distancing, sanitation, learning infrastructure, and teaching capacity. However, I think there is a duality here. Since education is the field of life, as I've indicated, and our government emphasizing the saving of lives, we have also seen this preoccupation around the saving of the academic year and the future of learners, while at the same time, the learners and educators at this point under level 3 are getting infected with the virus. We must also note that a death of an educator is not only just a death of one individual, it's also meaning that it destabilizes the fragile system in some parts of the country. But if we look deep about this reopening of the schools, we have also seen the reopening of the economy, meaning that some of the children at this point are left unsupervised. This is why today's webinar is important, since it helps us untangle this duality of saving lives, while at the same time keeping focus on the academic calendar. Let me just introduce the presenter and the discussants, and then I will speak to the format of the webinar. Our presenter is Hlengiwe Ndlovu, a doctor in waiting. Hlengiwe Ndlovu is an academic, a researcher, a political analyst, and activist. She's a PhD doctoral fellow at Wits University Sociology Department, a doctoral associate at the Society Work and Politics Institute, a doctoral fellow transforming humanities through interdisciplinary knowledge called Think. Hlengiwe is also the co-editor of Rioting and Writing, Diaries of the Vets Folist, which was released in 2017. The discussant, the first one will follow after Hlengiwe, which is Hopolang Selebalo, is a social justice activist and currently employed as the co-head of research at Equal Education. She has worked in social movements that address both education and housing in South Africa. Prior to Equal Education, Hopolang was the Senior Research and Project Manager for the Socio-Economic Rights Monitoring Program at the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. Her research interests include education, financing, and education policy. Twaita Ngogela is a final year student at Rhodes University, studying towards a Bachelor of Social Science in Industrial or Organizational Psychology and Sociology. She's interested on questions of structural socioeconomic inequalities and privilege, and how these shape access to higher inequality, to higher education. So I'll give it to Hlengiwe, who will speak for 15 minutes, and then the discussants will follow for 10 minutes. And after that, I'll open it up for questions. And when you have a question, please just post it on the site, and then I'll read it to the discussants. So once again, thanks to the people who will be presenting and the discussants and those who are joining us for our webinar. Thanks, over to you, Hlengiwe.
I think Hlengiwe is on mute.
You're on mute, Hlengiwe.
Am I back?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. Thank you, Mbuso, and thank you to SWOP for the invitation to present on this seminar series during these difficult times of the pandemic. So the topic today, hashtag Save the Academic Year, hashtag Save Lives, a popular slogan by the Minister of Education of late, the Minister of Higher Education, Dr. Blades Nzimande. So before I start with the contents of this perspective piece, I just want to note a few things. So this is not a talk about it is not a talk about advocating whether for the opening of the schools or the closing down of schools. So this perspective piece has got nothing to do with that. But it's looking at the existing inequalities that are already there, that are being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. But also it is not to underplay the severity of the virus in terms of how it affects the educators, learners, the lecturers and students equally. But also it's interested in ways in which how the virus does not discriminate along the issues of race, gender, sexuality, class, but also most importantly in terms of how those social stratifications sort of shape ways in which we face the pandemic with courage, with fear, with determination, but also with privilege. So that's what the virus does, even though it doesn't discriminate, but also those social stratifications kind of like shape ways in which we experience the virus. So maybe others might wonder, where did these stories, those who read the paper, where did these stories come from, which is a question of methodology. So just to note that I run two mentorship programs, one at high school level and one at university level. And these are the stories who have been shared by people, by students and learners within the group called the Ingomsolethu and also the Reading for Tomorrow Library. So work together, and during this time of the pandemic, we had to reflect due to our failure to meet because we can't meet. So what does this time mean for us now during these difficult times? And then this conversation starts at some village in the Eastern Cape where we were seated trying to navigate the internet. It's at the rural areas, and I'm having a conversation with Twaita, and the reason why I asked her to come here is because we know that in social research we participate in invasive research that also hijack people's stories. So some of the stories that I draw from, the owners of the stories are here as part of the audience as well, so that they can have their own views. But the story begins when we're sitting in one of the villages in the Eastern Cape and we're trying to navigate the internet because we all have work. Twaita is marking her tutorial papers and also doing my work, but the internet is unstable because it's a rural area. So she says to me, and this is a statement that I would have included in the paper, but because of the space, to unpack the statement in itself so that it is not, I know that Trump has said various statements that are racist in nature to sort of like speak about how the virus originated in China, but in a racist way. But the way I want to put this in context, so the statement goes, I refuse to be killed by a foreign virus when I do not even have a passport, let alone I've never left the Eastern Cape province. So it is important to note that this statement is said, and the stories that are written here are going to be unpacking this statement, which is said at a context of trying to navigate dealing with this pandemic, the lockdown, and what does it mean to study online or to learn from home. So I start with presenting 4 different stories. I'm sorry for those who read the paper, I'm not going to be referring to the pseudonyms that I gave here because I know these people personally, so I'll end up calling them by name. So I'll just refer to institutions. So I present 4 stories. And the first story is a vet student that I talk about. And this vet student is someone who came through our mentorship program at high school level and now second year at vets. And we're talking about what does it mean to study from home? And in this, I'm not going to go through the narrations in depth, but I'll just summarize them briefly for the benefit of those who did not get time to read the paper. So in the first story, I ask, what does it mean to study from home if you yourself, you don't even have a home? And this is speaking to broader issues of social inequalities in South Africa, because with this pandemic, what we've realized is, as a country in South Africa, we're a wounded nation structured by systemic and structural inequalities. So what the pandemic has done is sort of like to lay bare those structural inequalities, whether it's in the education system or in society in general. So what does it mean for a student who is at Wits, has a laptop, has a 30 gigabyte of data, of which 10 gigabytes is to be used during the day and another 20 at night, but you don't have a physical home, you are homeless, and your only home is the university residence that can give you a neutralizing experience of being a student. And then I also write a story from another student who goes to Walter Sisulu University. Ever since she started university in the beginning of the year, this academic year, she hasn't been to class. She doesn't know what she's studying whatsoever. So when the pandemic started and then when the lockdown was imposed, they were ordered to go home. But when we are saying we are saving the academic year at all costs, what does it mean for this student who has never met a lecturer, who doesn't know how her curriculum looks like? And this also further speaks to the structural inequalities within the education system in general, but also the specificities of the legacies of apartheid in terms of how it continues to structure forms of access and along the lines of privilege. And I put these 2 universities deliberately because Wits is a previously white institution that continues to enjoy that privilege, and Walter Sisulu is a previously Black university that continues to suffer along those lines of systemic discrimination. And I also bring together 2 high school kids. They are both in grade 12. The other one goes to a public school and the other one goes to a private school. And I want you guys to know that the private schools, of course, they are different, but the private school that I'm talking about here is not the types that write the IBE. I'm talking about the ones who write matric. So meaning that as we heard towards the end of the year, as we are saving the academic year, we're looking at how are we going to write the matric? What is the neutralizing effect? What is the neutralizing force in terms of going together to write? So one student continues, she is at a public school and she relies on her mom hiring private tutors to tutor her. And then another student goes to a private school, and as from the 6th of April, the online lessons started and they've been ongoing. When the lockdown was extended with a further 14 days, then the school rolled out. So initially they started with critical subjects that they consider to be critical, which is mostly STEM subjects. And then after the lockdown was extended, they then rolled out the whole curriculum online. So to say to them, the school never stopped, they continued. This paper asks the questions in terms of how do then the poor survive? How do they make it? How are they going to save the academic year? What does saving the academic year actually mean for them? And what do we learn about these experiences in relation to in relation to the elite education system? Because what is coming out from all these conversation is to say the education system has always been unequal, shaped by the apartheid, but continues to be shaped by everyday experiences. So I caught a tweet from my Vice Chancellor, Professor Adam Habib. He tweeted on the 15th of May in 2020, and I quote, he says, if you're not copying, you can do face-to-face learning when we return to a structured academic calendar, but don't stop others from learning if they are copying. This is what you need to internalize. Otherwise, you're being selfish. You want to stop others from learning because you are not copying. This is not fair, and neither is it socially just. So this is a vice chancellor of one of the top universities in the country who is determined to say, we are saving the academic year, come rain, come thunder. At all costs, we are saving the academic year. So what does it mean even for the bridging the gap between the high school and the university? If we are saying close the schools today, open them tomorrow, close them again, open, what plan does the government have to sort of like bridge that gap? Because even within the higher education itself, other universities are continuing and others are not. We don't have sort of a clear plan in terms of what does it mean for the grade 12 learners who are supposed to catch up and go to university next year, if even those within the institution of higher education now, it's a question of the survival of the fittest. It's a question of who is more privileged than the other. So those are some of the questions that these stories are bringing into the form. But also looking at, so I'm interested on the choices that people from the poor households have in terms of mediating the effects of the pandemic, and in terms of dealing with many choices that they have to make. How do you decide whether you have to send your child to school or they have to stay at home? At school, you know there is a virus. We're at the peak right now. But at the same time, the academic calendar is not going to change. It's persisting, it's going forward. So how do parents from poor households decide that I'm going to send my child to school or not? But also at the same time, thinking about what mechanisms do we have to bridge the gap between the high school and the higher education? What mechanisms do we have to level the privileges of the private schools and the public schools within the same area? So we're already tapping into the questions of systemic inequality that exists and that has always existed in South Africa, and how the pandemic has sort of like laid those bare. We're talking about, I think Buso highlighted ways in which schools are not only places of learning, but also places of shielding learners from a whole lot of things. A report was released from the research that has been conducted that says 3 million people have lost their jobs between February and now, and most of those are Black households and predominantly women. And here, when we're talking about women, even a girl child cannot be left behind, because during these times of the pandemic, they become the heads of the households at home. They become the caretakers of the home. And when we're talking about what we have called the frontline workers, the essential workers, on one hand, you have a mother who's going to school. On the other hand, you have a child. The ECTs are closed, and then you can't take that child to a preschool, but there is a girl who's supposed to go to university or to school. Now they take all those responsibilities. So now what the point that I'm trying to argue is how this pandemic is sort of like pushing the inequality gap more wider, because there are no catching up mechanisms. There are not even social systems in place to sort of like shield the learners from the inequalities that have already existed, but also giving them some tools and strategies to catch up. So in terms of what then does this mean? In this pandemic, it means then that it continues, and the education system continues to be a privilege of the rich, to be a privilege of those who can afford. When you are rating assignments of now, if you're a lecturer whatsoever, what you are doing instead of rating what students have written, you are rating privilege, you are rating a question of access, you are rating a question of who affords, who have a good quality space to study from. I'll leave it there for further discussion.
Thanks, Hlengiwe. I'll just give it over to Hopolang. Thanks.
Thank you, Mbuso and Hlengiwe, and looking forward to hearing from you, Twaita. Actually, Mbuso has told me to time myself, so let me do that. I'm really grateful that you pointed out these dualities in your introduction. You know, we're dealing with multiple complexities of trying to work out whether schools should close or remain open, and what each of these options mean. And I'm talking about this in the context of the basic education system. You know, on one hand, we're navigating the health and safety implications that COVID-19 has on learners and on teachers. I mean, we can chat some more, discuss this some more when the discussion opens up. But the science is saying that young learners aren't particularly susceptible, but adults very much are, you know, and adults with existing comorbidities in particular are vulnerable to the illness. And that's where now we have to factor in our teachers. So there's that versus schools, as you pointed out, being these spaces where learners have access to certain, I guess, resources, you know, food, psychosocial support, a safe space to be when your parents are at work or your caregiver is at work, versus the inequalities, the historic inequalities that we've been unable to address to this day. So even when I talk about safety, I'm still very mindful that schools aren't necessarily safe for everyone, as we know, particularly in relation to infrastructure provision. We've lost 2 learners, 2 young children, because of unsafe and undignified toilets. So even the element of safety, it depends on the privilege, the access, the kind of school, you know? So that's the kind of space in which we're navigating this pandemic. So I just wanted to say that to start off with. But basically, to agree with Hlengiwe that COVID-19 has amplified the inequalities in our education system. They were always there. It's just that, you know, now here we are where things feel more palpable and more urgent. But when it comes to infrastructure in particular, the DBE and provincial education departments are now burdened by their legacy of service delivery failures. So initially, when government began to talk about the phased reopening of schools, many of us were primarily concerned about infrastructure backlogs in non-affluent schools. You know, we were concerned that schools wouldn't be able to meet the requirements that would allow learners and teachers to return and remain safe and healthy during the pandemic in the school setting. And thousands of schools in April this year still had inadequate water access. Thousands more still had unsafe and undignified toilets. We know that many schools struggle with overcrowded classrooms, and some struggle with basics like even desks, where learners now have to share desks, even though now we have to social distance, you know? Then there was the issue of PPE, or personal protective equipment, that we now have to juggle in the midst of all of this, you know, masks, hand sanitizers, soap. And we know that a number of provinces were even struggling to deliver these materials, even when the date for schools reopening was announced. I think the date had to be shifted like three or four times because provinces weren't able to supply these materials to schools in time. So we wondered how government would overcome the challenge. And we were very much of the view as EE that no school should reopen unless all the requirements, or what government calls the minimum requirements, could be met. But firstly, I just want to give you a brief background on the infrastructure campaign that EE's been running for a number of years, and how government's inability to comply with the norms and standards for school infrastructure law has led us to this point. So we began our campaign in 2011, calling for government to create a law that determines what safe and adequate school infrastructure must look like, and by when. So the norms and standards were then adopted in 2013. And since then, we've been monitoring compliance across the country, but more specifically within the 5 provinces in which we are organized. The first deadline that's stipulated by the norms and standards is November 2016. And it says that all schools must have access to water, toilets, electricity, and schools made of inappropriate material like mud, wood, etc., must be eradicated and replaced. On top of that, the norms law said that the use of plain pit toilets is banned completely in schools. Fast forward to 2020. And learners are still telling us that, their schools don't have access to water, that many schools are still using plain pit toilets as their only form of sanitation. Some schools are still made of inappropriate and dangerous material like asbestos. And then COVID-19 hits, and then, it just becomes like a storm. It becomes a storm. And now government has to provide these necessities to ensure that schools can be open safely. So over the last couple of months, April, May, most of the interventions that government has introduced to provide these basics, water, sanitation, have been temporary solutions. So I'm talking about mobile toilets, mobile classrooms, and so forth. But we can get into what we identify as the problematic nature of these temporary solutions once we have our discussion. We've been fighting for long-term, sustainable, permanent infrastructure, and a pandemic hits, and we now have to deal with temporary infrastructure because we're in this moment. So now I want to move on to the challenges that learners that are part of equal education said that they faced during the lockdown. Members, as we call them, are called equalizers, and the high school going members. So in April this year, in the middle of the lockdown, we conducted a survey with just under 400 of our learner members to understand what being at home was like for them. We already had an indication after the Minister of Basic Education said that the department wouldn't continue with the school nutrition program while schools were closed, that learners who relied on the school meal would really struggle. And from our survey, we found out that almost half of our learner members or equalizers said that their households experienced financial insecurity during the lockdown. And it relates to what Hlengiwe had said about the needs cram survey that was released in the last couple of days, yesterday or the day before. So, and 37% of our equalizers said that they were not able to access enough food while schools were closed. And of 82% of the learners who received school meals, only 9% had received food parcels from government when we conducted the survey. And I remember vividly the minister saying 2 things. Soon after schools closed, the minister and people were already asking about school meals and what this would mean for learners. The minister said, school holidays are coming up. The lockdown is kind of overlapping with that period, and communities will do what communities have always done. An incredibly insensitive statement, in my view, to say about something as fundamental as this. And then as the lockdown continued, the minister said, DSD will be there to provide. They're a stopgap. We don't have the infrastructure to provide food right now. Note the budget is there. The service providers are there. All of it is there. And then we find out from a news article very recently that both SASA and DSD could not, reach was incredibly limited. I think SASA between the beginning of the year and May delivered only 77,000 food parcels. And we're saying that of 82% of the learners that get the school nutrition program, only 7%, only 9% said that they got a food parcel in their home. So already. So learners also reported feeling anxious while at home, especially because of food shortages and seeing their family members struggling to make ends meet. I just want to go through, I want to go quickly through this court case that we initiated with Section 27 and the Equal Education Law Center and schools in Limpopo around the provision of school meals while learners are not yet back in schools. So by the time we conducted the survey, we had already written to the DBE asking that the National School Nutrition Program be resumed, even while learners were at home. The DBE was reluctant, saying that they don't have the infrastructure. And they also said that it would be unsafe to do so because we were still under level 5 lockdown, right? So after much back and forth, and after the lockdown levels were adjusted, the DBE in May conceded that they would provide food to all learners who qualify for the meal. But just before schools reopened on the 8th of June, the minister then went back on her word and said that meals would be provided to grade 7 and grade 12 learners only. We wrote to the department again to say, this is not what you had said, this is not what you promised. And when we didn't get a satisfactory answer, we then launched a court case, which was heard earlier this month. So we're waiting to hear judgment on that. But basically the ask is that all learners that get school meals must be given school meals, whether they're in school or not. That's what we want to see. And then in addition to school nutrition, the survey also assessed the experience of learners trying to learn from home during lockdown. And many cited a number of challenges that learning from home presented. Some learners spoke about factors such as their homes being full, so overcrowded, that there were noise levels, there was lack of space, and other distractions, so it was very hard to learn. Others cited a lack of access to food made it harder to learn. Some learners said that they have responsibilities, including taking care of siblings and having to do housework. Other learners struggled with keeping motivated, while others were struggling with the mental health effects of the lockdown. 70% of the learners we surveyed said that they didn't feel confident enough to learn on their own. And other challenges related to lack of access to learning resources, such as workbooks, textbooks, worksheets. They didn't have access to those. And the difficulties in navigating online platforms where there is data, and that these online platforms aren't even in mother tongue. So now you have to navigate that space. And internet access is an issue. And even broadcast lessons through radio and TV, while helpful, were still unstimulating. They weren't interactive. And some of the content was also unfamiliar. But surprisingly, learners at the end of the survey indicated a desire to go back to school if schools were safe to reopen for them. So that's the other thing that kind of was like, okay, so now this is another element of things that we have to deal with. Mbuso, I know I've run out of time. Can I have 2 more minutes? Great, so, okay, thank you. So soon after, so we did the survey during lockdown. Then when schools were reopened for grade 7s and grade 12s, we're like, okay, we want to assess what conditions are looking like in schools. And we asked our members to do their own survey. We sent through a survey with a list of questions, and about just under 500 learners did the survey for us the first week schools opened. And we were trying to assess whether all the COVID-19 essentials had been provided, your masks, your PPE, whether learners were being screened, whether toilets were clean, whether there was access to water, et cetera, to ensure that there's safety in schools. And most learners were reporting that, like, yeah, no, these things are in place. It wasn't 100%, but like 80%, 90%. So it was looking better than we had definitely anticipated in terms of providing the essentials. But we were also very mindful that it's only grade 7s and 12s. So we don't have the full cohort of learners in schools, which would definitely change how things would look in terms of allowing physical distancing and things like that. We also asked very deliberately this time whether learners wanted to be back in school. And 80% of the almost 500 learners who took this survey said that they want to be back in schools. And I think for us, it also highlighted that essentially schools are environments that can, you know, that are, for lack of a better word, home, you know, where you can access your meal, where there's a certain amount of safety, where you can access psychosocial support, where you don't have to learn, where you don't have to struggle to learn on your own, where you can be with your peers. So there was that element in the middle of all the safety elements. But the thing that I want to end off with, because I'm running way over time, is that there's another side of the coin to this complicated conversation, which makes the situation even harder. And that's how teachers are experiencing school environments. Teachers right now are facing significant mental and emotional strain in the face of this pandemic. And we believe that it's one of the elements that has likely contributed to this is the complete lack of clear communication on safety protocols from provincial education departments, from the DBE, and lack of support from provincial education departments for teachers. And another element that could possibly be a contributor, which is the theme of today's topic actually, is this quest to save the academic year that's adding additional strain on teachers. How? When so much time has been lost, you know? And I'm looking forward to having a quick, like a chat with folks to hear about how we imagine how the rest of this year plays out academically with the curriculum. Are there catch-up programs? How are metrics meant to transcend? And all those other very complex, are they gonna write metric exams? Should they be writing metric exams? And all these other complicated questions that we now have to deal with post the infrastructure and PPE. Thank you.
Thanks, Hopolang. Then I'll hand over to Dwight.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. So I decided to write according to some of the questions that stood out for me from the invitation, right? So basically, for me, the South African education system has revealed through COVID-19 that it's very insensitive to individual situation, okay? I can say basically, in Xhosa, which means if you can, you have the means, let's just get going. And if you can't, jump. Okay, so if you're not privileged enough, for me personally, the vision of you graduating or matriculating is suddenly becoming blurred, right? On the outside, it may seem as though they're concerned about students and have students' best interests at heart, but the sad reality is that it's only privileged students that experience these of privileged students. And not actually the students that need it. There was leniency at first with submission deadlines and all of that. But then when we started leveling down with the lockdown, it's kind of like students' problems disappeared, you know, because now there was no leniency anymore for myself as well. It's the home dynamic that forces you to kind of try and find a place or collect your mental capacity to actually do some work, right? So now we're finding ourselves not learning anymore, but rather just changing. So family dynamics are shaky. Family dynamics are shaky. I don't know, I'm hearing that my connection might be bad.
Yeah, you're still with us. It's fine. Continue.
Oh, okay, cool. So family dynamics.
Xolita. I think Xolita has left us because I think it's an issue with the network. Maybe let me just do this. Let's just jump into a question and answer, and then we'll allow her some time to come back as soon as her network comes back. So I have a number of questions here, and if she hears me, I'm sorry about that. She'll just join us later. So I have a question here. I think it has been answered, the first one by Bakang Mputle, sorry. Bakang asked two questions about, the first one was about the digital divide, looking at the digital divide in regards to basic education, and how was it like? And another question is on the validity and reliability of assessment or the test and examination, given that not all learners have equal access to education during COVID-19. Will be the assessments be fair? And yeah, I think that's the first one. Let me allow that to be answered so that Xolita can just come back and give us a last few points. Yeah. And the others can just continue to post the questions, and then I'll read them to the panelists. Thank you.
Should I go for it? Or Hlengiwe, do you want to come in?
We can.
Okay. Okay, cool. In terms of the digital divide, definitely, I mean, that connectivity has been an issue in schools since, you know, for a very long time, particularly in rural provinces. And we're not even just talking about like internet access, we're talking about access to electricity at all, you know, so like it's even broader, it's bigger than just, you know, it's bigger than the internet. And it's obviously been a big issue and has been part of this, of our infrastructure campaign. But we honed in on that issue of connectivity during lockdown, in terms of, okay, so if learners don't have access to workbooks and textbooks and worksheets, which is what our equalizers were telling us, do they have access to, you know, these zero-rated websites that the DBE is talking about? And many learners were saying to us, firstly, some of us don't even have our own devices to use to begin with, to study, to access these websites. Even in the case where we do have our own devices, and in the case where we do have data to look at to pick up learning materials from the website, network is also an issue now. Like if you're in KZN, then you're gonna, like deep KZN, then you're gonna struggle with network access as well. So it's allowed learners in affluent schools, I mean, to continue learning, which is a point that I actually wanted to raise at the end of my part, is that learners in affluent schools are able to learn because they've got the resources to learn at home. You know, you've got your books, you've got your computers, your school is doing online lessons there, you've got internet access. But under-resourced schools are really struggling, and the digital divide is one of the contributing factors to that inequality, and to access to education, basically. I would like to give a moment to think about the assessment one, but it's definitely something that we have been thinking about within EE in terms of fairness. How would that look, considering that many learners will be will be struggling to catch up during this phase. You know, schools are opening and closing. The minute that there's a case in schools, some schools are closing for over 5 days, which means that learning is disrupted. So how do you assess learners on that basis? But it's a question that we've also internally been grappling with.
Okay, I'll jump in to answer those two questions quickly. So I think that's why I titled this page, this paper, this perspective piece as education as an elite education system, because it is clear that education is a privilege for those who are elite. Therefore, it's an elite education system, because if you're not an elite, it's difficult to access. So talking around the question of the digital divide, I think Hopolang has covered most of that. But I'm interested on the part of the higher education system and how top universities boost themselves as international universities, looking at the number of international students. So when we went to the shutdown, a lot, if not all, international students who do not have like maybe second homes in South Africa, they had to go home. And then you're talking about trying to equalize the question of access by distributing devices like laptops, and also distributing data. But you are talking about students who are in Mozambique or in Zimbabwe, who are in Namibia, and all of them. And I haven't really heard anything in particular from Wits that speaks to how those were covered, except for the from the communique that was sent recently when they were talking about data again. So the question is, when we're talking about the question of equality or inequality, and we are talking about these rankings, and we are talking about we are in international university, where are the international students during a time where we are saving the academic year at all costs? Where do we leave them? And also the question of a digital divide in terms of bridging the gap between high school and university. I remember I had a conversation with Hannah. She's in the audience, one of the organizers, about the NBT test, the National Benchmark Test. So institutions like UCT, they have indeed sort of like cancelled the NBT test, but I've been doing applications in the past few weeks for other students, especially at Wits. If you are doing degrees like social work, they still require an NBT, which is in itself speaks to the gap between speaks to the mistrust between the higher education system and the basic education, to say you need a neutralizing test that will say indeed you pass your matric, but at the same time you need to go through the NBT so that you qualify to study for a particular course. So what is happening now is the NBT is saying we can't do sit-ins, so NBT tests are to be taken online. So these are prospective first year students for university for next year. So it also goes back to a question of who has access to online to online resources. So in order for you to sit for a 4-hour long test, if you're going to be writing both exams for the NBT, you need to have an uninterrupted internet access of 4 hours. That is data, but also in terms of where are you located, if you're located in the rural areas, but also talking about load shedding now, how is that even possible to navigate, even when you're talking about this online schooling with load shedding on one hand, and what is even finishing the academic year at all costs, what does it mean in such a messed up society, in such a cracked society? So those are some of the questions. And I think that also covers the question of the validity of assessments, because these are learners who are going to sit for a matric exam, of which the Minister of Basic Education and Democracy repeatedly said that Umalus is not going to change anything from the paper, because when the paper was set, there was no COVID-19 on the picture, so the paper is still like that. So on one hand, in the Eastern Cape, they are open, in Gauteng they are not. And speaking to other learners that I'm working with currently, other schools, the grade 11s, even those who are not allowed to go to schools, they send emails to say we have met the standards, the criteria, the standards and everything, so our learners can come. But others are sitting at home. So when you are making these learners sit for the same exam, what is the neutralizing factor to say the assessment is even fair? I don't think there is any fairness in that, and I don't think it's even I don't think it's even a question of assessing learners in terms of whether they've understood, they've grasped the course material or whatsoever. It's a question of assessing the question of privilege, the question of whether I can afford or I cannot.
Thanks. I'll take these 4 questions that have been posted. So the first one was about addressed to Hopolang, that if it's possible for you to share the data that you cited when you were doing your presentation. And this one is from Victoria Bronstein. She's asking if can there be a from Kali Forrest. Kali is asking, do you think education in the time of COVID has opened up new ways of thinking about education and possible new opportunities in future? And this one is Mike Kent, drawing from his perspective, saying, from my perspective as an educator, it seems like challenges around the drive to save the academic year arise due to the narrow goalposts set out by the academic or educational system, i.e. the matric exam or end of year exam. Would some of these challenges be eased if we thought more creatively about the goalposts and shifted them to account for the pandemic? I would like to hear the panelists' thoughts on this. And then the last one I think I'll just take for this one, this round, is Talita Kaya. Talita is asking, can there really be a solution then, or that somewhat benefits everyone? Or should South Africans just accept that inequality will persist and there's nothing that can be done about it? So I'll take this, and then we'll just try and run until, let's say, 2 or so. So yes, let me just hand it over to you.
Okay, I managed to catch some of the questions. So in terms of sharing the data, not that it's a problem to share the data, we're still we're going to have to compile it into a report. So we've got a preliminary report or draft document that we have internally, but it hasn't been circulated yet. We've released some of the findings in a media statement on our social media platforms and the like. But we're still working to consolidate that into a narrative. And then education in the time of COVID, having opened up new ways of thinking, or potentially opening up new ways of thinking. Perhaps when we think about the curriculum, there's potential to think about what education could be, you know. It's a very difficult question to answer. I definitely do think that in terms of the curriculum, that there's potential there about what teaching and learning could look like, what content is covered, you know. And I mean, a colleague of mine often tells me that teachers say they're so overburdened with the CAPS curriculum and how much they have to cover in a year under what we would deem normal circumstances. But maybe this is a time to reassess whether the way we've been functioning under those normal circumstances actually can be adjusted and altered. It definitely presents a moment to, and maybe this speaks to the last question that Mbuso posed, or a member of the audience posed, it definitely presents an opportunity to address the inequalities that exist within the sector, from the infrastructure backlogs that learners and teachers have to deal with. There's clearly like a more urgency to address these matters right now. But I would like to be optimistic and say that I don't think that like our inequality, like inequality will be that this is what it is and we must settle with it. It can't be what it is. It's unfeasible for it to be what it is. Like, this is a moment where we now have to address the challenges that have been confronting the system all this time. Please do let me know if I've missed a question. You faded out on me for a little bit there, but if I've missed anything, let me know.
Okay, I'll quickly jump in. In terms of new ways of thinking about teaching or how we've been doing things. So my connection is also a bit poor, so I didn't get all the questions, so I had to go back and read. So I might end up answering some of the questions that you had not read already, but yeah, because I missed some. So in terms of thinking about new ways of teaching and doing things, I think the debate around the question of decolonization has been key in terms of how do we plan to address the future challenges. Of course, the global pandemic was unexpected, this COVID-19 thing, no one knew it was coming. But what it has taught us is to say, if we had a just society, if we had a properly functioning society, things would have turned differently. So the whole question of decolonization, it also questions the assessments themselves, whether it's the exams or or the different ways of teaching that we engage in, and they remain key, especially around this time, to say, do we really need the grade 12s to sit for a particular standard set exam in order to see that they qualify at different universities, but also with universities setting different standards of their entry into the universities. So I think this is an ongoing discussion that we must engage both at the basic education level and within the higher education, in terms of asking about and coming with innovative ways of thinking. And that is connected to the question of inequalities. It's okay to let inequality persist. Are there any ways of sort of like curbing inequality? I think this pandemic has taught us more than ever that an unequal society is unsustainable than ever. And when you look back at the initial 21 days of the shutdown, when you are saying these are essential services and you're marking the already prospering supermarkets like Woolworth, ShopRite and all of them, and then you are saying everyone stay at home, what does it mean? You propose an unemployment grant, but 3, 4, 5 months later, you haven't even paid a quarter of that unemployment grant. And then you have people going outside to say, you know what, we are tired of this thing. And I think that's the quote that I was trying to open this conversation with, to say I cannot be killed by a foreign virus. Not necessarily to say that because the virus came in from China, but to say this virus in itself, what is more dangerous, to die of hunger or to die of a virus that is unknown, that is not? So you are seeing it's killing people, but at the same time, you might die from not having food, from the inequality and all. And I saw a question about whether we should concede to Professor Jonathan Jansen's to say maybe we must cancel the academic year. I'm not sure if I'll take that stance to say cancel the academic year or do not cancel the academic year. As I said in the beginning, that this paper is not about arguing for or against, but I'm saying, what mechanisms do you have if you are canceling the academic year? Is there any neutralizing mechanism to say, if you cancel the academic year, the grade 12s, what are they doing next year? Are they going back to grade 12? Are you sure that even the private schools, like those who write the IPE exams, are they also canceling the academic year? Are there not going to be intakes at the universities and all of that? Because universities, they seem to be having some level of independence, so they do things mostly according to their own way because they do their own assessments. So if you are canceling the academic year at Wits, if you're cancelling the academic year at high schools and everything, Wits is saying we'll finish the academic year come rain, come thunder. Even if we don't finish it now, if you can't drop out and then you come back again. How do we cancel the academic year without having a conversation of then what when you cancel the academic year? How are we coming back to the same table and have an equal conversation about the mechanisms to be taken after cancelling the academic year?
Okay, thanks. Let me continue with this round. Those who still have questions can just drop one because we still have like 5 more minutes or so. Musibud is also asking if she wants to understand or ask about what gets lost when we focus on the most pressing material needs. If one takes all the social ills all the panelists have discussed in total, no access to meals, overpopulated homes, lack of access to learning material, precarious shelter, etc. Is there space to also address the mental and psychological stresses on students and learners in this time who are dealing with their own issues as well as parents losing jobs, evictions, the heightened GBV, etc. And the other one is also coming from Prishani Naidu. She's asking this is addressed again to all the panelists, and Kwaita, if you're still with us, you can also answer. She's asking, where do you think the solutions to some of these problems lie? Are there ways that we can begin to address some of these problems in the immediate term? And yeah, I think the others have been answered. So let me just give it to you to answer that. Thanks. And again, I think the question of the provincial, looking at the different provinces and their infection rate, what would be then the strategy? Because it has not been answered. Thanks.
Okay, cool. And I'll move quite quickly, be mindful of our time. So the provincial question, I think, even relates to the ward question. You know, where there's prevalence, where infection rates are high, what happens? Do schools close? Do schools not? And this relates to my last point around poor communication and perhaps even poor implementation by the Department of Basic Education and Provincial Education Departments. And this is probably what has parents and teachers and learners in such high, feeling so incredibly anxious, is like just not having a clear idea of like what happens when there's infection in a school, but also like high rates of infection in a particular area. In almost every DBE engagement I've been in, the DG has spoken to a risk-adjusted strategy. Basically, it says that if there are high infection rates in a particular area and then lockdown level is adjusted from, let's say we are on 3 now, goes from 3 to 5, you know, where 5 is like, okay, like there's community spread, like things are dire, like we need to shut down, then schools would then have to comply with that particular lockdown. And that it would be particular to, I don't know, a ward or a metro or so on and so forth. But basically schools would adapt to whatever the lockdown level is in that particular area if infection rates are high. And that would bleed into provinces as well. But we actually haven't seen that happen in practice, you know. We have Gauteng is now the epicenter of the virus. There are particular areas in Gauteng where community spread is quite high, where infection rates are high. And the WHO has been saying like that's a very precarious situation to be in. You know, you don't want actually your schools open when the infection rates are high. But the department hasn't actually utilized this risk-adjusted strategy. So people don't know. It's shared in the public domain, it's spoken about, but it hasn't been implemented. So that's in relation to that question about what happens in provinces and wards when it comes to infection rates. And we've been calling for the DBE to explain practically how this adjusted strategy will actually work. Like how will it work? So that everybody can understand, so that people have a certain sense of some certainty rather than just this chaos right now. And then the question, I think Hlengiwe had answered it, and I just wanted to jump in just as she answered it, as she was answering or she was speaking about canceling the academic year. I agree with her. Like, what does that mean? What does that look like? What are the implications of that? Are we saying cancel the academic year, let us not continue in the way that we have in terms of curriculum delivery? I mean, the DBE has talked about curriculum adjustments, curriculum trimming for grades that are not metric, you know? Is that what we mean? Like, so must we envision like catch-up plans and what the curriculum must look like in 2021? Is that what you mean? Or are we saying close schools? But if it's saying close schools, then we need to think about the conversation that we were having earlier about what schools mean for learners in this moment. Access to food, to psychosocial services, to a safe space when parents are at work. And how do we make those decisions? I think it's not a decision that one could take lightly, you know? And I mean, the DBE has also often cited international organizations like UNESCO about what it means when learners stay out of school for too long. Learners drop out, you know, like there are so many variables that I don't think one can simply say cancel the academic year. And then please remind me of the other question. I just want to go back to reading it. It was quite a long one. Is there space to also address mental and psychological stresses on students in this time who are dealing with them? I mean, our survey definitely highlighted during lockdown that learners were really struggling with mental and emotional health challenges because of everything that's around them. Your parents are losing, and your caregivers don't have income coming into the house. Learners are hungry, and all these various factors. And in this instance, school becomes a refuge because then you have access to that meal and you have access. It's quite imperfect, but it's there. But you've also got access to psychosocial support, you know, to help you, I guess not necessarily deal, but like just navigate the situation that we're in currently. So this is the difficult conundrum that we find ourselves in.
Also, is Twitter online? Maybe
Yeah,
she wants to jump in.
Twitter, do you want to say something?
I don't know. Literally, most of the questions that have been answered and have been asked covered most of what I was going to touch on. So looking at, I was going to discuss no work, no pay households as well. And with regards to data and children needing more data to access YouTube, more articles to grasp content for school. So you have parents buying data more than ever now because 10 gigs doesn't last. And I don't think everyone is up midnight working as much as they would during the day. So yeah, there's that. And I also wanted to share taking from the article that Hlengiwe shared with us. There's a similar story of a boy from my village who needed assistance with biology, grade 11 biology to be specific. I showed him that I'd get him necessary notes and tutorial sessions with friends of mine. And I asked for his cell number to, you know, do the whole thing over WhatsApp or email. And he said he didn't have a phone. So then that brings in the situation of now you're trying to get an education in the best way possible, but you're exhausting resources that you don't even have. You know, he was willing to do all of this online thing, but obviously without a cell phone, you can't. And his parents can't provide it because, you know, situation at home is not okay. And yeah, the whole issue of mental health issues with this pandemic and trying to save your semester is like, now when you're not as privileged, you have to work 3 times as hard just to stay afloat. And obviously this is a lot, I know personally. And yeah, I don't know, because most of the issues I was gonna touch on have been covered already, because
Okay.
yeah.
No, thanks, Kwaita. So I think before Hlengiwe, you go on, I'd also like to open it up to this question, I think, which is quite important. What's possible in the immediate? What are the kinds of possibilities that we can begin to speak of when it comes to education? So I think we can just leave it there and then I'll close here.
Okay, so in terms of psychological issues or psychosocial issues, it's an interesting question because we're having this conversation about the learners now. But I've also wondered, what does it mean? What does this mean for educators, for lecturers, for everyone who has to wake up in the morning and go and teach or teach online to upload? Are we even? I asked myself when I was tutoring last semester that, am I even psychologically stable to assist students myself? If I didn't see any mechanisms, if there were any, to sort of like as an intervention. And of course, many learners and many students that I'm working with, they are very distressed. And I remember in the past, about 3-4 weeks ago, Umbali Mazibuko sort of like opened up a space that was hashtag stand in the gap, in terms of how graduate students in the humanities and social sciences were to stand in the gap across the country, not just our own universities. And that came after a realization that a lot of students across the country are struggling with this Save the Academic Year. And we received an overwhelming number of students who were looking for help, not only to say with assignments, but how do I cope under such circumstances? And it had nothing to do with, please send me data or something like that. It had everything to do with, I'm not coping with this online teaching thing. I tried to ask my tutor, but I don't think they also understand what they are doing and all of that. And it's a mess. So in terms of, there was a question about immediate solutions to this whole problem. I'm not quite sure if, I think we need a conversation about immediate solutions, because this train is moving, is not even stopping. You are told if you can't cope, deregister, and then you see when you can. But I think some of the ways that we have tried to mediate the situation is what I've said, that as a social justice project, as a in terms of academic citizenship or a social justice project, what do you do as an individual to stand in the gap? I think for me, that's one of the most feasible things for now. But because we're speaking of the structures of power, if we're going to say, let's boycott teaching, maybe the Faculty of Humanities or maybe the School of Social Sciences will boycott teaching while the other faculties are continuing. And I'm seeing from other students that I'm working with. In the Sociology Department, we had to adjust the course material, what we had already said for the students. We had to take out some of the not so important stuff so that we can try to mediate the situation. But I saw students in engineering and all that I'm working with, nothing changed, nothing whatsoever. That's changed. The curriculum is still the same as if COVID-19 has never happened. You just moved from face-to-face to online. So what does that mean, and how do we intervene at that level? Because we need a broader conversation at a government level, but also at schools level, at universities level. I saw the president 3 days back, he said, we took a collective decision to open schools, so we have to take a collective decision to close schools. I was never consulted for whether I want to open schools or not. It was, you know, of course, there are those consultations where they say comment within 3 days, but what does that mean? And I think there were louder voices that were saying, no, do not open schools. But it kept on saying international data says, international evidence says, and says, and says, and not to say it was wrong, but I'm saying, where do we start in terms of talking about a collective conversation? And one last question on the provincial question. The provincial question is a tricky one, and I think we're in this mess because of that, of those differences within the provinces. I think it started when when we started opening schools. The Western Cape was by that time the epicenter of the virus here in South Africa. So they started to say, we are ready to open schools. We are ready to move on to level 3. And then everyone else therefore is ready. And then to say, okay, things are happening here and the whole country has to be on the same level. But at the same time, when the other grades were rolled out last week but one, not all provinces were able to roll out grade R's and other grades, but other schools continued to roll out other grades. And I think it goes back to the question of, is the assessment even fair? Because so it looks like it's an ecosystem thing, like a survival of the fittest. Even if we are now the epicenter of the virus, what is happening currently in Gauteng is schools are pushing, they are moving forward to close today. Tomorrow, if it's grade 10B, maybe where there is a case, they just close 10B, 10Bs go home, and then the rest of them, they come to school. And there is not an equalizing sort of like mechanisms as of now. And in terms of how do we then intervene? But I think the intervention, of course, it has to come from our voices, but the question is who's listening as we try to speak right now. Is the government even consulting enough to take some of our inputs into consideration? So yeah, I think it's a tricky one. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks to everyone who joined us and took their time to be with us. And firstly, I'd like to extend my appreciation and thanks to Hlengiwe and Hopolang and Ndlovu for the riveting presentations that they did. And there were key perspectives regarding what we are facing in relation to education. And let me just emphasize again to say that I think the Zoom conversation is just also a continuation of what is already happening on the SWOP website. So the paper is posted here again so that everyone who did not get a chance to write to the authors or the presenters today, they can just post their comments there and they'll also get answers. And I also feel bad that Toyota had an issue with the network. So if it's possible, Toyota, you can also share, I think, what you are supposed to present, and we'll also post it on the SWOP website under Hlengiwe's presentation so that it can also be made available to the others. So once again, thanks everyone for joining us. We'll also share the next webinar, and the same principle applies. There's a reflection which you can comment on. So if I did not take your question, I'm sorry, but you can continue the conversation on the website. So cheers, enjoy your weekend. Bye. Thank you.